I'm delighted to be speaking for Sangam Talks. The title of my talk is The Indian Foundations of Modern Science, and this would probably appear very surprising to most people who have gone through school and college in India, because what the school books tell students is that there were things in India in the ancient times which were remarkable, such as there was some astronomy, and there was certainly the number zero, which India was ahead of everybody else. And finally, after several centuries, it was adopted by Europe. It went there via the Arabs. And although Europe took a couple of centuries to accept it fully because they had trouble with negative numbers, but eventually it became a part of worldwide mathematics. So people do know this, but I don't think there is any sense that India has done anything beyond it as far as the creation of modern science is concerned, which, as all of us know, has changed the world in astonishing ways. The world now, because of the various kinds of technologies that have emerged in the last couple of 100 years, is very different from the world that existed and which was basically unchanged for centuries, if not millennia. So what is it that I have to tell you which you're not aware of? And whatever I'm going to be telling you is all a part of scholarly consensus. So this is not something that is out from the fringes. It is accepted by all scholars. And hopefully some of this will also come to India before too long. Now, let me start first of all with quantum mechanics. Now, this is not quite where Indian knowledge led to this science directly. And as we know, quantum mechanics is at the basis of chemistry. You can't explain chemistry without quantum mechanics. And without chemistry, you can't explain biology. And without biology, you can't understand brain structure and neuroscience and everything. So quantum mechanics is truly fundamental. Now, one of the two creators of quantum mechanics was a Austrian Vedantist named Erwin Schrödinger. And in his autobiography, he says that the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, gave him the central intuition which was necessary to set up the framework of quantum mechanics. So at least in terms of inspiration, we are not saying anything more than that. In terms of inspiration, Indian thought played a role there. But more to specifics, where we look at the superstructure of modern science emerging in a particular way. Let's go back to the 17th century and look at the beginning of the scientific revolution. The beginning is generally marked by the invention of the mathematics of infinite series, because that allowed calculus to be reformulated in a fashion so that one could apply mathematics to all kinds of fields, from materials to gravitation to other forces and processes in the world. Now, for a long time, it was believed that scientific revolution took place with the invention of infinite series by Newton and Leibniz. But in the past 40 or 50 years, it's emerged that about 300 years prior to Newton and Leibniz, infinite series were developed in India, in Kerala, by a whole tradition which has now been called the Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy, and which tradition also made extremely important contributions to astronomy. And there are many scholars who now propose that the Jesuits who were present in South India at that time took this knowledge with them to Europe, and it percolated in the intellectual circles and finally gave birth to the mathematics of infinite series that we just talked about. So this is one. The second foundation of modern science is mathematical logic and machine theory. Now, this is traced in standard histories to three Englishmen. Charles Babbage, who is sometimes called the father of the modern computer. He tried to build a mechanical computer where the control was done in a fashion very similar to how a program works. So Charles Babbage, Augustus De Morgan, we have De Morgan's laws of set theory, and George Boole, we have Boolean functions and so on. People who've done computer science or mathematics would know that. So these three people were part of a salon, intellectual salon in London in the mid 19th century. And then they developed their stuff. And as we know, it was to change the world. Now, George Boole died not so much after these events, maybe a decade or so. And his wife, Mary Boole, outlived him for many, many years. And in the 1890s, she wrote a very famous essay where she mentioned that the mentor to these three gentlemen was one George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India for many, many years. And he used to come to London from time to time. And according to Mary Boole, George Everest apprised his mentees, these three young men, of the knowledge that he had picked up in India from those who did Navya Nyaya. And Navya Nyaya, now scholars know, is equivalent to mathematical logic. Navya Nyaya was a development beyond Nyaya. Nyaya, as we know, is the traditional Indian system of logic, which is prior to Aristotelian logic. So it's about 500 BCE. And there's, of course, some speculation also, which has been written up by Persian and other scholars, that this logic was taken from India to Greece with Alexander and prior to him. So it may have even played a role in early Aristotelian logic. But this development of Nyaya arose about 1,000 years ago in Bihar and Bengal, became Navya Nyaya. And now scholars from all over the world have agreed that Navya Nyaya is equivalent to mathematical logic. And mathematical logic is what you need to create machines. In fact, as we know, a computer is nothing but embodiment of these logical gates, which are connected together in a particular way. So Mary Boole, in her essay, said that George Everest told these three people about the Indian tradition of mathematical logic, which is what inspired them to come up with their ideas. And therefore, in this sense, India did play a role in a creation of a whole branch of mathematics, which has played an absolutely revolutionary role in creation of modern science and modern society. Another important area is all of social sciences. Often the birth of social sciences is seen in the work which the Frenchman de Saussure did in taking ideas that he abstracted from his understanding of Sanskrit grammar as created by Panini. Now, as you know, Panini, about 400 or 500 BCE, created this amazing system of 4,000 algebraic rules, with also rules about rules, which is how a computer program works. And de Saussure was so impressed that he said, well, language is just one of the behaviors that humans participate in. Other behaviors that humans participate in are social interactions or social behavior. And therefore, these behaviors should also be conducive to similar analysis. And that's how sciences of sociology and anthropology and others were born. So in a certain sense, de Saussure used his understanding of Indian intellectual framework that had been created by Panini, and not just by Panini alone, but by a whole series of scholars to give rise to all these modern sciences, modern social sciences, which have also transformed the world in fundamental ways, because they have made it possible for humans to study other societies, not just their own, in a way where you can relate to them in an objective manner, in a kind of a neutral way, by just trying to abstract the rules that are a part of their interactions. Now, the other person who was a progenitor of all these ideas is the author of the Natya Shastra, Bharata Muni. And as we know, Natya Shastra, which is variously dated to maybe 200 or 300 BCE, is not just a manual of acting. It also has music. It has musicology. It has science of gesture. It has a whole lot of stuff. And as we know, Natya Shastra is also sometimes called the Pancham Veda, just as the Mahabharata is also called the Pancham Veda. So it has intellectual or formal structures within it, which anticipate how similar formal structures have been used in the analysis of society in the past 100 or 200 years. So these two texts, one Panini's Ashtadhyayi as a framework, and also a framework for the very discipline of computer science, because Ashtadhyayi, the rules of it, can be seen as a computer program, because they both contain the rules and they also contain rules about rules, which is what you require in a computer program. So this, of course, is absolutely breathtaking that in all of these fields, such a substantive impact has been made by Indic ideas. Now, let me also sort of turn back a little bit and speak of certain broader ideas that have been a part of the discussions amongst intellectuals for a long time. Now, we do know that, first of all, for the last 300-400 years, after the interaction between Europe and India was resumed after the European powers were able to trade directly with India. Now, such an interaction, of course, did exist in the ancient times through the Silk Road. And as we know, there was much that can be traced back. First of all, there were Indian merchants and scholars which went back and forth between India and through the steppes of Central Asia to the Slavic countries and beyond. And there was trade, substantive trade between India, southern India, and Rome. In fact, the historians in the centuries BC in Rome were complaining that Europe is, or Rome is getting bankrupt because they have to pay so much of money for the spices that they had gotten addicted to. And big hordes of European or Roman coins have been discovered in South India at many places. So there was this interaction that had been going on in the ancient world. And this interaction had many aspects to it, including ideas related to medicine and so on, just as you have various pranas, you have breaths in Greek medicine. There's also, as we know, in the Slavic world itself, the Slavic world, the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians and the Lithuanians, and further down, the Czechs and the Serbians, etc. They were the last to be Christianized. In fact, in the countryside, in the Slavic world, it was only about 1500 or 1600 CE, which is only 300-400 years ago, that people gave up on their old traditions. And in fact, it wasn't so easy for the church to change. And in fact, the Slavic church had to make some concessions. As we know, in the ancient world, in ritual, the movement that was considered the auspicious one was the right word, which in Sanskrit is pradakshina, or keeping the deity to the right. And likewise, in the Roman world, it was dexter. Dexter is also keeping right ways. But when the Roman religion was superseded by the church decided to do counterclockwise movement in all ritual things. But the Slavic church, since it was a latecomer, was not able to convince the general population, and therefore they had to make a concession. And in the Slavic church, they still go right ways. The left word movement, of course, in Latin is called sinister. The right word movement, which is pradakshina, is the dexter movement. So there had been all these interactions, and part of these interactions, of course, were the movement of ideas from India. And the reason why ideas were going from India, because as Sayyid al-Andalusi, the Moorish Arab scholar writing in 1068, I believe, in his book on science of the world, proclaimed that India is the world's first scientific nation. And he also mentioned all the other major nations at that time, including the Persians, the Arabs, the Romans, and so on. But he said India is the world's premier scientific nation for a variety of reasons. And clearly, these ideas had reached him in Spain through all the other intermediate nations. And these were not just a reflection of Indian mathematics, because Indian mathematics through the Arabs had triumphed or was to triumph all over the world. It were other ideas related to the whole nature of the world, of the place of mind, of the human mind within the world, where, as we know, India has been very, very advanced. Yoga, for example, is just an expression of this understanding of the inner world. And these ideas were impacting the ancient world as well. And not just to the West, also to the East, through China and through Southeast Asia. They were to make a major impact and perhaps shape the classical civilizations of China and Korea and Japan, and certainly the impact that they had on Indonesia and Southeast Asia, Thailand and Champa, Vietnam, and so on, is much better known. Now, there are two specific things that I will add to here. One is medicine. There is a fundamental difference between modern medicine and Ayurveda. Ayurveda is the classical Vedic discipline of medicine. And that is that allopathy, modern Western medicine, is based on treatment of symptoms. So it is a binary approach to the world of health. Ayurveda is based on triple categories. You have three doshas, you have three gunas, and in fact, three gunas are also fundamental, as we know, to yoga itself, to Sankhya. You have Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, and so on. Now, it so turns out, and this is something which is not widely known, and it touches upon the very epistemology of medicine. Now, in recent years, mathematicians and logicians have discovered that binary logic is not optimal. What is optimal is ternary logic. Ternary meaning in categories of three. And Ayurveda, it turns out, is based on ternary logic, and allopathy is based on binary logic. So there could be tremendous implications of it for the future. Now, Ayurvedic Vaidyas are not aware of this epistemological foundation and how it is validated by mathematics and logic. And so this could have implications, and this could also have relevance to the crisis that modern medicine is facing right now. And this is called the reproducibility crisis of medicine, which is that almost 70 to 90% of clinical research, which is published in the leading journals of medicine, cannot be reproduced. And there has been a lot of discussion of it in medical science. Why can't it be reproduced? Maybe it's the confirmation bias. Maybe it's because a lot of this research is funded by big pharma companies. So doctors are under a lot of pressure, if not conscious, unconscious pressure, to confirm whatever hypothesis they began with. But then there are other troubling aspects which are not understandable within the epistemological framework of modern medicine, which is this whole idea of placebo, that between 30 to 40% of patients get well even if they are given sugar pills, or 30 to 40% of patients get well even if they are given fake surgery. If fake surgery is done to them and they are told that the surgery has been done, and they seem to get better in exactly the same way, 30 to 40%, not all, in the same way as the subjects on whom the actual surgery had been performed. I was talking to a very leading biologist the other day, and he says in some cases, the placebo effect can go as high as 70 to 80%. And what this really means, one way of looking at it, of course, there are many unknowns about this whole issue. One aspect of this is that modern medicine leaves out the mind, while Ayurveda includes the mind also within its framework, and the mind has an impact on the body. Modern medicine leaves that out. Ayurveda does include it in. And maybe, therefore, the medicine of the future should be based on such tripartite logic, and maybe the next revolution in the sciences would take place in the field of medicine, where Ayurveda would be pulled back into the mainstream, and it would just not be talking only about Sushruta Sanghita or Charak Sanghita or Ashtanga Hridaya, but create new treatments and new ways to approach ill health and disease based on the fundamental three tripartite or three-way logic epistemology of Ayurveda. Now, finally, I must also speak about where modern science is going. Modern science is also, with all the amazing things it has achieved, it's also facing great crisis. In the physical sciences, the crisis is that it cannot explain the movements of the galaxies and the stars and so on using the gravitation theory of either Newton or Einstein, because these stars are flying away at very high speed, and that's why it's being forced to postulate dark matter and dark energy, which is supposed to be 95% of the universe, and 4.5% is interstellar dust. So all of physics is based only on 0.5% of the observable universe. That is truly a crisis point. Clearly, something has to give. And what, it's not quite clear. Is it that modern physics leaves out the subject, and maybe the next revolution will be in incorporating the subject, which is the individual, into the framework? And here I must also add that another Indian foundation of modern science is the whole framework of Vaisheshika, which is Indian physics, which goes back to 500 or 600 BCE, the rishi called Kanada. And Kanada, in his sutras, already had laws of motion, including the sutra that to every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and an object will keep on moving unless its motion is interfered with, quite like Newton's laws. And they've been sort of not paid any attention to in India, sadly, although in recent years they have come back into the public eye. Kanada also postulated 4 kinds of anus or atoms, and 2 of them with mass and 2 of them without mass, quite similar in coincidence. Of course, it is a coincidence, just like proton and electron have mass, and the photon and the neutrino do not have mass. So this is, let's just call it a coincidence. But what's interesting is that Swami Vivekananda, who was aware of Vaisheshika, because in fact, until about independence, most Indian scholars were quite knowledgeable about Indian scientific tradition itself. It's only after independence that we chose a path where almost no Indian knows anything about Indian sciences or the Indian Shastras. But now what's interesting here is that Swami Vivekananda was aware of it, and Swami Vivekananda, as we know, in the 1890s was a big star. I think in 1896 or 1898, on his second or third visit to England, to New York, the great French actress Sarah Bernhardt, who was traveling with a troupe to New York, threw a party where she invited Vivekananda, and she also invited Nikola Tesla, who was the most famous American scientist engineer of that times. And we have a record of that meeting in a diary note made by Tesla in his diary, and letters that Vivekananda wrote to his disciples soon after the meeting. So apparently at that meeting, Vivekananda told Tesla that, look, according to Indian physics, and what he meant was Vaisheshika, it is possible for mass to be converted into energy. So you, Nikola, why don't you sit down, because you're also interested in wireless transfer of energy and so on, why don't you sit down and come up with a theory which would explain how energy and mass are interconvertible? And we do know that Tesla was not successful, but another Serbian, uh, Einstein's first wife, I believe her name was Elena, it's been conjectured, was in touch with Tesla because Tesla was the big star. And Tesla told her that maybe this is a problem she should work on. And we do know that the great 1905 paper of Einstein was originally, when it was submitted to Annalen der Physik, had two authors, namely Albert Einstein and his wife together. And it was only when the proofs came in that Einstein took his wife's name out. But we also do know that when the two of them got divorced, one of the conditions of the divorce was that should Einstein win the Nobel Prize, all the money will go to his wife. So there have been all this raging speculation for a long time that maybe Einstein's wife had something to do with the theory. And if that is true, and if the story of Nikola Tesla's connection with her is also true, then there was this indirect, even though one might say it was a small influence, there's this indirect influence of Indian physics on one of the biggest developments that was to take place in modern science, in relativity theory. E is equal to mc squared. And we already, right in the beginning, mentioned the influence through Schrödinger on quantum mechanics itself. And quantum mechanics has changed the world. And most scholars of quantum mechanics are agreed that the framework of quantum mechanics is totally consistent with Vedanta. It's not just that Schrödinger said that, look, the Upanishadic Mahavakya was the point of inspiration to me. What they say is whether he had said that or not, the way it has emerged in the sense that the world operates by law. In the Vedas, the word is Rit. From Rit comes the word right. It operates by laws, excepting when consciousness interacts with it. And in fact, this is one of the paradoxes of modern science. If everything is by law, then how do humans have freedom? And in Vedanta, this was discussed a long time ago, centuries and centuries ago. And the resolution is this idea of Drishti Srishti Vada. The whole idea is that consciousness and divinity is one, consciousness is one, while in our minds we see we are separate because our minds are separate, but the consciousness that makes these minds work is one. It's just like you have a single outer sun, but it shines in a million different pots of water. This is how Vedanta looks at the whole phenomenon of consciousness. So in Drishti Srishti Vada, consciousness is able to steer the evolution of the physical universe just by drishti. And this idea was formulated into a mathematical framework, but by my late friend, the great Indian physicist George Sudarshan, who passed away last year, in a paper with his student in the 1970s, which is called the quantum Zeno effect, where he was able to show that just by observation, without expending any energy, the observer can change the evolution of a quantum state. And in fact, the observer can also steer the evolution of a state in whatsoever direction one wants. The quantum Zeno effect has been demonstrated in the lab, in many labs across the world. And therefore, this shows that Indian ideas of consciousness, which are fundamental to Indian thought. In fact, the Vedas proclaim that what the Vedas are all about is is the science of consciousness. They're about what is called Paravidya. There are two Vidyas, Mundak Upanishad tells us, Apara and Para. Apara Vidya is the science of things, of all that we see, of all material things and all concepts. That is Apara Vidya, and for which we need framework, for which we need language. And all we study in colleges and universities is Apara Vidya, and that's very essential. We are told that in order to go to Paravidya, you must first of all train your mind by studying Aparavidyas. But Paravidya is the Vidya of the subject, of the experiencing self, because normally our consciousness is projected outside and it cannot project itself onto itself. And that's why you cannot use language to speak about the problem of consciousness. And this is the true frontier of science, because the question is, can computers be so designed and designed to mimic the way the brain works, so that just as the brain is aware, brain has consciousness, computers will also have consciousness. And if indeed this could be done, then the world will be changed, because then these computers will have no need for human beings, and the whole history of mankind would enter a new phase, possibly without mankind. Now, there are many scientists and leading scientists in the West who believe that computers will eventually become conscious. And in fact, I was part of a group which was set up in the US to debate this question over many meetings. And when we took a poll in this group, and these were physicists and computer scientists and neuroscientists and others, about half thought that computers will eventually become conscious. The task was for us to, through our discussions, determine, if not now, if not in the next 20 or 50 years, if ever in the future, computers will become conscious. And about half people thought that they would become conscious. And their logic was that as computers become more and more powerful, they would be able to embody and mimic more and more processes in the brain. And at some point, as the complexity of the machine passes a threshold, suddenly consciousness would emerge. But the other half, and I belong to that other half, and this other half had many quantum researchers or theorists on it, thought that this would never happen, because consciousness is forever apart from the physical framework that we have in any formal system. Even in the Newtonian physical system, the observer is always apart. The observer is talking about systems which are striking each other or moving in this way or that way, while the observer is always apart. In quantum mechanics also, the observer is always apart. And only through the idea of the quantum zero effect, you are able to bring in the observer much more into the system. Now, what about prognosis for the future? Well, the future movement of science would be, first of all, to deal with the problems associated with dark matter and dark energy, whether it can be solved. Now, of course, people are looking for dark matter and dark energy, but maybe there is no dark matter and dark energy. It's only because of the way the problem of cosmology has been posed. And perhaps if this perspective were to be changed, and maybe that's where the ideas of Indian science would play an important role. Let me go back once again to Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. What Kanada says there is that all that is to be described of the physical universe is to be done in terms of dravya, which are substances, gunas, which are their properties, and karma, which is their motion. So he says all of the physical laws or physical behavior ought to be explainable by talking of substances, their properties, and their motions. Beautiful. This is very modern. But then he also says that as far as our comprehension of this universe is concerned, there are three aspects to it, and that's where the mind comes in. And these aspects are samanya, which is universal. There are certain properties which are universal. Vishesha, which are particular, which is where the word Vaisheshika comes in. And Vishesha based on how the subject relates to the physical system. And then finally, Samavaya. Samavaya is that interaction between the mind and the physical system. This is very modern. It has ideas of not just universality, of invariance also embedded in it. In fact, one of the points that Kanada mentions is that, well, the anu, the atom, must be spherical, because if you looking at it from any particular direction, it should be the same property, which is an invariance law. So extremely interesting. And I do urge all the listeners of this program to get hold of Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras. I did the first translation from a physics perspective 4 years ago. It is easily available on the net. It's a book called Matter and Mind, and you should look at for yourselves and see what an amazing thing it is, and perhaps it needs to play a greater role. If we could understand better the idea of samavai, we'll see other connections between some of the crises that modern physics is facing and questions that were discussed so many years ago. One of the very sad things that has happened in independent India, because prior to independent India, I think people were still connected to traditional shastras. And just to clarify, shastric knowledge from India is not religious knowledge. Shastric knowledge is all formal knowledge. It's all scientific knowledge in the way science is seen now. For example, the traditional Vyakaran, Ashtadhyayi is not a religious thing. There are no assumptions being made. It's a formal system. So is Nyaya. So is Navya Nyaya. So is Sankhya. Sankhya is, of course, different categories. Or even Purva Mimamsa has formal structures to how you look at ritual, for example. And then yoga is a theory of the mind, and it's a theory of the mind which relates it to the consciousness principle, that there is a single consciousness, and in that it can be made consistent with Vedanta, and it also is of great significance in the very understanding of how pedagogy should be done, because one of the other crises that the West is facing is the crisis of education, that the focus is just on information, that the mind is a vessel into which you pour information, details about books. But then the young person now says, why should I memorize all this? It's all available at the fingertips anyway. So maybe what is of more significance is to learn the ability to discriminate between what is right and what is wrong. And that is fundamentally the idea which is at the basis of Indian thought. In Indian thought, education is to light that flame of the mind. So there the mind is seen, or the task of education is to light that flame. And so if one could do that, then possibly the whole question of where science should go from where it is now, so as to grapple with all these fundamental questions. Also in psychology, because in psychology there's no room for agency. In neuroscience, because there is no neural correlate of consciousness. Based on different cognitive tasks, different parts of the brain light up. And then you also have paradoxes in neuroscience. For example, you can have alexia without agraphia. I just spoke about the placebo effect, but you also have things such as alexia without agraphia. In alexia without agraphia, let's say there is a brain injury or a stroke, and after that, the person goes into a coma and he comes back and everything seems to be normal, excepting that the subject loses the capacity to read, and that's called alexia. Obviously, what has happened is that the brain center, which processes letters, although the person can see everything else properly, that has been damaged. But now in alexia without agraphia, having lost the capacity to read, the subject is still able to write, so long as he or she is not looking at the paper. So all of these paradoxes, which can be understood within the framework of Indian psychology, the yogic and the Ayurvedic framework, because in the yogic framework, what are called the various divinities, the various devatas, are these cognitive centers within. So the cognitive centers hold up the inner sky. You have the outer sky where you have the stars. You also have the inner sky, within which all the cognitions take place, in which all the discussions take place. So we, having lost that understanding of our own shastras, we very sadly, over the last 70 or 80 years, have allowed writers, these were Indologists who didn't understand the Indian sciences, who were using 18th century categories to look at this very subtle framework of Indian inner and outer sciences. And we, after independence, have allowed these Indologists to create the framework which has been written into our textbooks. Very sad, truly very, very sad. And it's no wonder then that people who go through these textbooks where such incorrect and false information is given to them, full of half-truths, that they grow up and then they can't understand what this is all about and they want to sort of run away from it. So this is a big challenge that we face to apprise everybody, Indians and everybody, because this is all universal knowledge, apprise Indians and other as to the true meaning of Indian sciences. And what I've tried to do in this conversation today is to just take one very small element of it related to modern science, because I thought it'll be easy for people to see that, because most people are fairly proficient in modern sciences, but there's this whole world of inner science as well, which is quite a closed room right now, even in the West, and that's where all the challenge is. And this challenge is going to get even greater. Why? Because the next few decades are going to be huge disruptions in economy and in societies due to pervasive automation, or what is called AI. More and more jobs will go away. So as jobs go away and people speak about universal basic income, and people have more time, and they also have maybe more depression and questions related to existence and meaning of life, they will turn to these fundamental questions. And it's these fundamental questions where Indian Shastras, Indian tradition have addressed. over the past millennia. And the great German historian of art, Heinrich Zimmer, wrote about it in the 1940s in his book on history of Indian art, where he says that, look, most Westerners are astonished and amazed when they have an encounter with India, because they realize that what West has come to confront now was addressed by these sages at the banks of Ganga, Yamuna, and Kaveri 3,000 years prior. And that is what comes as a shock. And it comes as a shock which wakes you up, because this tradition is full of such extraordinary wisdom, and it's a tradition which is universal, which everybody should question and test out for themselves. It's not where you are to take something because somebody is telling you this. This is a tradition where you are given a roadmap through these shastras, and then through your own journey, which you might call sadhana, or you might call education, self-education, if you will, self-education beyond classroom, beyond aparavidya, where you question the very epistemology of aparavidya and ask the deepest and the most perplexing questions. And as you ask them, you will see that what the rishis had written a long, long time ago have lessons that are still of value. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to address any questions that you might have.
Getting ready. So you mentioned that we have not promoted, especially after independence, particularly after independence, we've not promoted any Shastric knowledge. All of that actually lies in the way the Articles 25 and 30 of the Indian Constitution discriminate between what is religious, and everything which has been Indian thought has been classified as religious texts, and therefore anything which the state touches is it's you can't teach that. So there can be a University of Hinduism in Thailand, but not in India, unfortunately. Even if that were to be addressed at some point in time, it's a very hard battle. Wouldn't some call this revivalist attitudes, trying to relive the past instead of looking forward in modern science? I know you mentioned a little bit about towards the end on the inner sciences, but just in the framework of, outer sciences, if you like, wouldn't this be called revivalist? How would you answer that?
Not at all. What we are talking about were two things. First of all, we were talking about how Indian Shastric knowledge has already played a fundamental role in the development of what is called modern sciences. Okay. And so it's good to know it. It's good to, and we are not anti-modern science. In fact, we embrace all of science. Science is universal. But what we are talking about now is that modern science also has tremendous crises confronting it. And I mentioned some related to physical sciences, neurosciences, psychology, even medicine. And the point I'm trying to make is that in these, the Shastric tradition that we have will yet play a fundamental role, just as the Shastric tradition played an important role in the 19th century and early 20th century, although Indians may not be aware of it. So likewise, it appears that these ideas will yet play a fundamental role. And I already mentioned, say, medicine. Modern medicine has a tremendous crisis confronting it. If 70 to 90%, John Ioannidis, who's a professor of medicine at Stanford University, has written a famous article called, can we trust any of the clinical research at all? And in fact, I wrote a article where you'll see the reference citations called the reproducibility Crisis of Modern Medicine on medium.com that you might wish to explore for yourself. So what is one to do? And as we see in the recent COVID crisis, big pharma plays such a powerful role that even though in countries where hydroxychloroquine is being used as a prophylactic, where the fatality rate is much lower in countries where it's not being used, in many countries, people are not even prepared to use HCQ because of the power of the vaccine lobby, which wants only vaccines to be given to patients. So there is a tremendous interplay between various vested interests and the evolution of the workings of modern science, certainly in the workings of medicine, where step back and looking at it in a rational way. And how could we do it in a rational way? I mentioned the whole idea of epistemology of Ayurveda. You can't throw out modern medicine. Modern medicine is extremely valuable. You know, you have issues, surgery, symptoms with whatever crises one might have. You have to go to modern medicine. But maybe what is required at this point is to take a step back and see whether this whole idea of ternary logic, since ternary is more efficient, is optimal compared to binary, can provide a new foundation to medicine. And likewise, the whole idea of the observer, which has already played a fundamental role in the evolution of physics in the 20th century, starting from relativity theory itself and certainly quantum mechanics, can it play an even greater role where you must, of course, not just teach all this stuff. You don't teach Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras just because it's out there, but do it as a vital study, as a vital study where you are approaching or using it as a living discipline to approach contemporary problems. That's what needs to be done. So the word revivalism is sometimes seen as something pejorative or negative because you're doing something just for an emotional reason. But that's not my case at all. We must do it because it makes sense. We must do it because the subject cannot be explained within the framework of modern science. You cannot explain where awareness or where consciousness comes in from. And here we have a different framework of Indian Shastras where consciousness is the more fundamental category, as in Vedanta. So why don't we approach it? At least why don't we do research on it in a vital way? I don't think there are many people who are looking at it. Certainly, there are fewer people doing it in India than they are doing in the West. There are many, many more people. There are universities which are much more sympathetic to all this study in the West than is the case in India.
This is Mohit Yadav from Nagpur. I just have one question from you, being from a very conservative background, and living in an ambience where traditional things are very discouraged, in fact, seen very lowly in the society that surround us. What should we do to teach our children who are on the verge, the children who are younger, especially 8 to 12 years, how to respect our traditions and get into the science the way you are talking about? Because it's very difficult given the scenario that exists in India, the CBSE syllabus and all that is being taught to the kids, to get into the next level of consciousness, because it's very difficult to the kind of ambience that is prevailing in India right now. So what is your take on the role of parents to get the kids on the next stage that we are discussing just now? So.
Very good question, Mohitji. I totally understand what you're saying. It's a big challenge. Just the other day, my attention was pointed to this famous essay that Sri Aurobindo wrote in 1907 called The Bourgeois and the Samurai. And Sri Aurobindo made the point that in the 19th century, when Japan was forced to modernize, they maintained the spirit of the samurai with the warrior, and they accepted all of Western science, etc., and they internalized it, and they were able to incorporate that into their very consciousness. And Japan has made fundamental contributions to so many aspects of science. Japanese scientists are amongst world leaders, while India took the path, in Sri Aurobindo's words, of the bourgeois, meaning the office clerk. In other words, just to be a facilitator to the Westerner without standing up and speaking for himself or herself. This is a challenge. We haven't changed that. Nobody speaks for India. All of Indian education is the Westerners' view of India, which is totally incorrect. What were the two fundamental elements of the Westerners' view of India? First was that India is a society based on caste, and therefore Indians cannot govern themselves. And this is a fake idea, because we forget that before the coming of the British, India's share of the world economy was, say, about 25%. By the time they left, it had dropped to 1 to 2%. So the British, during their period, through a system of tariffs and by disallowing the creation of factories in India as the Industrial Revolution took off in Europe and in England, by making India simply a dumping ground for their factories, they made India so poor that these communities, which were like communities elsewhere in the world, because when India was prosperous, these were communities, they were flexible, they changed, and we have evidence that people could change their, they went from one place to another, they joined laterally in whatever social grouping they could get into based on what they did. All that got frozen during the British time because of the horrors that visited India, which Indians were not even aware of, because it happened slowly. This diminution from 20 to 25% to 1% over a century and a half was one of the most horrific historical changes that has taken place in the history of mankind. So they said that, look, this is what your problems are, so you need us to govern you. And the other reason why you need us to govern you is because you don't have any science, which is totally false. Now you know that Indian scientists are everywhere, accepting that within India, we've chosen the path of the consumer of science. We have not chosen the path of creator of science. There is nothing sarjanatmak, creative, within the Indian scientific bureaucracy. Even in technology, we have become consumers of technology. We only consume products, or at best, we service products of others. In other words, just as at Fort St. George in Madras, the English set up their factories, and then they had workers who worked on creating those products. Now you have Western companies or their Indian counterparts. They have set up these shops in Bangalore or Chennai and Mumbai, where Indian programmers do what they are told to do, just as the clerks in Fort St. George did what they were told to do, ledgers, to do bookkeeping and so on. We have not, in the last 50 years, created a single product. This is not the path which either Korea or Japan prior to Korea or China have taken, or certainly Europe. They are striving to create their own products. India has chosen the path of no products. India needs tremendous Atmavishwas, self-confidence, to be connected to the higher truth. And this is precisely what Sri Aurobindo said. And just imagine, 113 years ago, he foresaw what was going to happen in India. We chose the path of the consumer, the path of not standing up, not the path of the truth. You cannot have liberty if you're just trying to make compromises all the time. What India has chosen is the path of compromise at every step. Hey, just give us peace. We don't want to address the basic questions. And I think it's a big, Moji, it's a big question. It's a big challenge. We need our school books to be transformed. We need at least one course in college and high school where a history of Indian science is provided to the kids so that they know that, look, India is the creator of sciences. India also had the best ships before the coming of the Europeans. Indian ships used 3 masts, and we see that in Ajanta pictures. And so Indian ships were better than European ships until recently. But we have been somehow in textbooks, because it suits the leftist worldview, the left and the imperialists very strangely have become on the same side, and the colonialists. So their view is that India didn't have any of this. So India needs somebody else to guide them. So Indians cannot think for themselves. So it's the Western scholar who has to interpret the Indian text for us. It's the Westerner who has to tell us which direction technology must go. We cannot decide for ourselves because we are too afraid. We have to stand up for ourselves. We have to be warriors. And we probably that rebirth is taking place. I would hope that it's taking place. And maybe we are in that change over the past few years, in that Sandhya era, where suddenly things will be changing and changing for the good.
Dr. Kak, that brings me to the question. You mentioned that we history of Indian science in our textbooks in English is great. Earlier, you had mentioned that we should perhaps read Kanad's Vaisheshika Sutras. I know you've done a translation, but most Indian texts, the translations are generally very poor, one hears. And so, how do you even read such texts? Firstly, they're possibly in Sanskrit. So there's a related question from Narayani Barveji. She left it on chat for me. Is the knowledge of Sanskrit important, or to read Indian texts and get into depth, or can one do it without that as well?
Well, the question of, you said poor quality of books. You're absolutely right. What India has to be dedicated to is that spirit of excellence. Krishna instructs Arjuna, yogaha karmasu kaushalam. You have to do everything with kushalta, with that sense of excellence and perfection. Often we are so used to the quick buck or the quick statement, not doing the enough work that is necessary in order to master. It's this framework that we are in. So what we need, and this is a point that I've been making, that even in technology, there are some wonderful people in all fields, in scholarship, as intellectuals, as technologists, as scientists, some great individuals. But when I'm doing this criticism, I mean, collectively, we must also acknowledge what shortcomings we have. So what we need to do is to identify the champions who are dedicated to excellence, and encourage them to create new technology. This is the method that both Japan and Korea used. In Japan, the system was called Kairitsu. In Korea, it's called Kaibol. So in Kaibol, companies which had already experience at doing outstanding work, they got into new products. And in India also, we have these companies. We have the Tatas, we have the Ciplas, we have the Mahindras, and you have many other companies. So let them get into newer products. And likewise, we have great scholars. So we must have them mentor new scholars. Now, as to your question of Sanskrit, certainly the more Sanskrit you know, the better it is. But all of us within India already know Sanskrit in a certain sense. The vocabulary in all the Indian languages is the same as that of Sanskrit. With just a little bit of effort, we can get into the original text. But we are not just talking about doing these texts only from an antiquarian perspective. We are also talking of using the intuition obtained from these texts to do ongoing and contemporary problems, both of science and technology. For that, you don't necessarily have to go back to the old text. So it's a combination of many different things.
I want to give you appreciation. I read your book, Ethical Code of Rig Veda, which was one of the greatest motivation to study Vedic studies. Now, my question is, I frequently visit your websites, and some of the articles I read in which you mentioned you mentioned that Sanskrit is the most appropriate language for it is most suitable language for artificial intelligence. Now, what my understanding says that Sanskrit has one sentence will have one objective, one message can be written into 3 or 4 ways in Sanskrit. As far as I understand, it is not it is unclear.
I think I got the general drift of the question. Was Dharmeshji was saying that there's an article which says that Sanskrit is the best language for AI. This is an article which appeared in the 80s by a fellow called Rick Briggs. And basically what he was talking about was Shastric Sanskrit, which is Sanskrit which was used by Navya Nyaya, which is really the same as what gave birth to mathematical logic at the end. If you're using Shastric Sanskrit in that specialized way, it's like using a computer language. And therefore, to be fair, I don't think from a practical perspective, you can use Sanskrit for AI. Because if you're using Shastric Sanskrit, where every word has a very specific meaning, which is the same thing as using a computer language where you have to define every term afresh. So personally, I don't think that's going to make a difference. But clearly, it is going to be good for everybody's psychological mood to have a better appreciation of what the Indian knowledge system has already achieved, and then to use that to confront the problems that the world of science and technology faces at this point. And as I mentioned, that there's so many of these problems, and therefore then participate as equals and as leaders in this debate, because this debate will come center stage all over the world over the next few decades, as I was pointing out before, due to the pervasive effect of automation. Questions of meaning would become more and more important. And that's where the Indian Shastras address related to the very question of who we are. And they address it from the perspective, from a scientific perspective. You know, whatever you want to take of it, and you might say, I don't care for it. I just want to live life as it is. And they would say, that's fine. You know, it's up to the individual. Science is up to the individual. A person may not be interested in physics, that's fine. A person is not interested in neuroscience. Not everybody has to. But the Indian framework has something in it for everybody, because it is a all-comprehensive one. It's a universal one. It doesn't discriminate between any individuals. These are sciences for every human being to partake of, irrespective of where they are from, what their background is. This is universal knowledge. This is what India should awaken into, because if Indians were more aware of it, certainly India would be changed. And if India is changed, the world will be changed.
My question essentially is that, I mean, in general, if one sees a pattern, and I've been listening to some of the Sangam talks and many other such initiatives going across the world right now, what you really mentioned is true, that large part of Indians, including the educated ones, or what I would call more as literate ones, are getting emotionally attached to the revivalism piece that the host mentioned about. The question is, you are a man of technology, and instantly so am I. I also work in the field of IT here in the US. What I find is, how can we leverage technology, apart from, of course, YouTube is also a technology that we're using right now, but more so to not only take this knowledge to the masses, which means if it's a country like India, it will be multiple languages as well. And while doing so, revive the logical and rational capabilities of using these references to make journey forward, rather than having an attachment that, oh my God, my ancestors were so great, and then just stop there. Because then that doesn't really lead to any development. That is, so one is, how do you use technology to do that? Second is, there are lots of individuals, and I would include myself as one of them, who would want to make contributions in this whole field, if I call it this whole field of how do we kind of make the education better, but to some extent are lost. So do people like you or others provide some kind of mentoring to create more individuals who are like, if I may call them as junior Subhash Cox, if I may use that term, kind of people who want to contribute but don't know how to do that? And the third is that in the absence of that, do you see that just as the economic prosperity traveled from east to west, from China to India, or rather from India to Europe to US and all that, the intellectual prosperity also is going to travel that way, and we probably will have to see a new generation coming up in India over the next few decades to actually restart or that whole logical, rational journey. So sorry, I asked 3 questions in one, but I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Sure. Ketanji, very, very, very good points. First, the first question was, how do we leverage technology to add to this process? Well, we all know that the brick and mortar university is almost become bankrupt, or it's on the way out. And there was a time for it, because there was a time when books were available only in central libraries. Now everybody has all the books available at their fingertips. So why do you have to travel to a university and pay $50,000, $70,000 a year, when all these lectures are freely available anyway? So all of this is going to change, and there is a professor at Harvard Educational College who says that half the universities in the US will go bankrupt in the next dozen years in America. So Indian education is a disaster because of whatever decisions India made. And there was a political angle to it, because the left wanted India to be destroyed or alienated from its past so that it could be remade into the ideology that it espoused. That's why India was the last thing, because of the emotional attachment people had to their ways. So whatever they may have done, technology comes in as an aid to us, because we can sidestep all those formal systems which have left India chained to this totally incorrect view of themselves. The self-image that Indians have is totally wrong. It's changing now. I'll tell you why. It's changing now in India also because Indians are the most prosperous ethnic group in the US. So in India, people wonder if for the last 50 years we are told, and even Nehru in his Discovery of India mentions that, or in his autobiography, that when he was studying in London, the general understanding that people were given were that the Anglo-Saxons were number one, or the Germanics, then were the French, then were the Italians, then were the Slavs, etc., and Indians were maybe number 10 in this hierarchy. And Indians have actually believed in it. And they may have acted, braggart in their talk, but in their heart, they have felt that, hey, there's something wrong with us. But all that is being given and lied to by the achievements of Indians in every corner of the world, in every field, and certainly in the US, which is the most level playing field that there is. So with this, Indians are saying that, look, maybe we have been misinformed. Maybe we should stand up and say things just as that little boy who said that the emperor had no clothes. That's what we need to do. So I think the challenge, and I think the Sangam lectures and others like this could be the incipient beginning of something new way of delivery of knowledge, and not emotional attachment to anything. That's the last thing that I'm talking about. We're talking about things which are universal, which stand out in our own mind's eye, with our sakshi, the neutral self within us, who says, yeah, this makes sense because you and the other are no different from each other, right? So we are talking of universal truths. So there is a promise there. How to do it, nobody knows. It's a challenge even in America. America is also in crisis. Europe is also in crisis. How do we do it? And I think Indian wisdom, Vedanta is going to be the way. I'm not saying it because I'm from India and I'm attached to it, because it makes sense. There's nothing else that makes sense. If you're only bodies, as Western education system tells you, then by the time we are in our 20s and 30s, we have lived through all the sense things that we could do. We feel totally lost. We get into addictions, we get into opioids, and we kill ourselves. If 70,000 best looking young people from the best backgrounds are killing themselves in America, why are they doing so? Because life is not giving them anything worthwhile. What India offers, what Vedanta offers, what the Vedas offer is a whole new world of infinite possibilities for every individual. It's not for this or that, for every human being, that everything is not machine-like, everything is not linguistic. There is para, which is paradoxical, which is transcendent, and it's within us, and every human being has the potential to achieve it. And whatever we can, I think all that we can do as individuals is to just stand up and say the truth with clarity, without being afraid. Because in the past, I think India also had certain problems. One of the problems was that some people thought that they were special. That's all false. Every human being is equal. We must truly believe in it. And once we believe in it, then all the Vedic wisdom shines forth with such brightness and with such power that it transforms oneself, and it has the potential to transform everybody else. So I think what we can do is first of all, we have to go through that churning. We have to do that samudra manthan within ourselves. And it's only through that churning that we get access to all those wonderful intuitions, which transform not just oneself, but which have the power to transform others as well.
Somebody's put this on chat, says Indian sociology relies exclusively on Western theories and concepts. How did Indians study their society? Which texts should we read if we were to understand Indian society from the perspective of Indian scholars? I'm guessing he's referring to the past.
Indian view of rulership and society were scattered in the Dharma Shastras and in the Puranas and in many other texts also. Now, there is need to disentangle it from its times and present it in new ways. And there are some great scholars, both in India and the West, who have done it. For example, there's a scholar in Holland named Hesterman. He looked at the whole question of rulership, and he argues that Indian idea of governance was not absolute power with the king. And the king and the mantri offered checks and balances on each other. And the power of the mantri came from his embracement of poverty. He was not attached to anything. The mantri lived in a hut, right? So the king could not do any inducements to him. It's a very interesting, subtle concept. So there were checks and balances. The idea of checks and balances is a great one. What the founders of the American state did by their idea of checks and balances has given all the energy to the American state, which is how America has become so rich and powerful. And other countries like Argentina, which was very rich 100 years ago, since it didn't have checks and balances, it has floundered in spite of its great material wealth and low population. So India also had a system of checks and balances. And you had travelers like Huan Sang in the 7th or 8th century CE, spent 20 or 30 years in India during the period of Emperor Harshavardhan. And he says that, look, India is extremely wealthy. There's almost no crime. So there was a whole system. We need to, of course, bring it in a fashion so that it can be related to in modern vocabulary, in modern narrative. So there is a need to do that translational work. But there are many different sources, and they were also, we must acknowledge, there were things within Indian society which were probably something that we won't approve of, and we should discard that. We should look at the past with this need to be fair to whatever they existed, and not accept just because some Western writer in his half-baked understanding of India, for example, this whole idea about Varna and Jati, on which I've also written, even for anthropological journals. For example, I wrote an essay for Mankind Quarterly in 1989 or 1990 called Understanding Caste in India. And this whole idea that this was a hierarchical system where there was one jati sitting at the top is totally wrong. And Western scholars now acknowledge it. But in Indian textbooks or sociology books, this easy things, because most of these books are just copies, second and third hand or fourth hand copies of material, which now scholars have shown was wrong, but people are still reproducing this old stuff again and again. So lots of battles to be fought.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture and insights into our scientific contribution in the earlier generations. The question I have is, as you know, the current education system, I call it as a rat race, where everybody is towards one thing, one objective of accumulating a degree. And I don't see any particular change in the new education policy 2020, which can highlight our achievements and percolate it down to the last child. So as they say, between the ages of 6 to 12, a mind can be properly trained. And it is in this period that we actually do the wrong thing of inculcating a wrong history to the child. So one thing which I want to highlight is, way back in 94, there was this booklet released by the government of Karnataka, which talked about the contribution of Indians towards science. And it had all the references right from Rigvedic period to the most recent 500 BC or so. So my question is, how do we take this knowledge to the child and make it work for the Indian scientific community as a whole? And is it possible without the government support?
Big question. It's not possible without government support, because education is totally run from top down. See, in countries like America, where education is distributed, there are many district level authorities who take these decisions. So there's democracy at work at lower levels. In India, things are done from top down. So the government decides, and then it percolates down. So it becomes a bigger challenge. So I think what is needed is to keep on the pressure on the government to at least make a beginning. And this should not be political at all. We are not talking about religion here. We're not talking about worship of this deity or that deity, right? Whereas people might say that, hey, you are advancing one religion over another. We are talking of science. We are talking of science which even a Muslim Spanish scholar writing in 1068, namely Said Andalusi, said India is number one. India is world's first nation in science. Or even Al-Biruni, who came with Ghazni, he said, India's sciences are the greatest. So why can't we do this minimum? And why do we need it? Somebody might say, does it really matter? Well, it matters because if you don't have Atma Vishwas, if you don't have faith in yourself, you would then not have faith in wanting to change the world. The real problem in India is that, and I expressed this, said this before, you cannot love somebody else unless you love yourself. Indians have been taught not to love themselves, and they are somehow told, hey, you love America or Europe. But if they don't love themselves, their love for America or Europe also is hollow. So they become like hollow people. What they want to do, America, and want recognition from America is all, fake, because Americans can see through these people that these people are hollow. What Indians need is not, we want Indians also to love the West. The West also has wonderful stuff, but they will be able to do it properly only after they love themselves. That is the first step. After they love their own language also. This whole thing about learning everything through English is the most destructive thing that could be done. Why should people have to learn programming through English? Why can't people be taught programming through Kannada and Tamil and Hindi and Bangla and whatever else? And they can use the Latin alphabet. That's perfectly fine. We are doing the most stupid things in the most obvious fields. I don't know who's been taking all these decisions. We must bring it, in all corners of the world. People are horrified that here, India, with its ancient culture, with its rich literature, the greatest literature there is, we don't even teach the sciences in our own languages. How is the child have to have confidence in himself? If you don't have confidence in yourself, you don't have love for excellence. What India is lacking most of all is a love for excellence. That's why even the products we make are shoddy products. Even the scholarship, a lot of the scholarship, and there are always exceptions, it's not a blanket statement. But by and large, even the scholarship, even the stuff that people do, they don't do it with enough commitment, with enough yoga, enough tapasya associated with that task. So we need to do what it takes to be attached to our each tradition, to our language, and then also learn English. We are not against English at all. Also learn English, but you can learn English well only after you learn your own language. And you do that, you should be attached to excellence. Then whatever you do, you will do well. In fact, this sense of excellence is more to be found in our grandmothers and in our grandfathers in villages who want to do things as well as they can. And where it is most missing is in the westernized and anglicized part of our population. That is where the big challenge is. And maybe now we can inspire them. We can inspire them to go back to their roots and tell them that, look, the rest of the world is looking up to it. What's wrong with you? At least give it a chance. And if you don't like it, then throw it off. But give it a chance. Why do you want to reject your past without giving it a chance?